Binnall of BinnallofAmerica.com with another edition of Binnall of America Audio Season 2. It is December 23rd, 2006, and this is the Binnall of America Audio Season 2 Christmas Special. As it was last year, so shall it be again this year. Our guest is a living legend in esoterica and the father of modern-day ufology, Stanton Friedman. If you're like me, you've heard countless Stan Friedman interviews. This is the third time I've interviewed him myself. So I knew if we were going to make this a holiday tradition here on Binnall of America Audio, we had to go above and beyond your average Stan Friedman interview. We're going to discuss pre-modern day ufology, what got Stan interested in UFOs in the first place, the evolution of his speaking on flying saucers from a part-time side hobby to a full-time career, all the twists and turns along that road, and some of the key individuals and events that played a role in Stan Friedman becoming the father of modern-day ufology. From there, we're going to discuss the 1968 congressional investigation into UFOs that he contributed to. We're going to talk about an event that occurred just a few months after that, the release of the Condon Report. What was the mood like in ufology at the time? What was the immediate effect on the field when the infamous Condon Report was released? Stan was there. He was on the front lines. He's going to talk about what it was like during that tumultuous period. We're going to discuss the infamous NICAP versus APRO feud. Where were the similarities and differences between the two groups? What were some of the sticking points and disagreements? Stan was in the mix at the time. He dealt with both organizations. He's going to tell us some great stories about his dealings with NICAP and APRO. Additionally, we're going to have some big picture discussion on Binnall of America Audio's staple topic of young people in ufology. Why aren't they gravitating towards the field? And what does ufology need to do to attract young people to the study of the UFO phenomenon? Stan will offer his thoughts on this pressing problem within ufology. Plus, of course, as is the case here on BOA Audio, tons and tons more. This episode is rich in detail and is a veritable history lesson in ufology. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Stanton Friedman, first I pity you, and now I will give you a little bit of background on him. Stanton T. Friedman received BS and MS degrees in physics from the University of Chicago in 1955 and 1956. He was employed for 14 years as a nuclear physicist for such companies as GE, GM, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, Aerojet General Nucleonics, and McDonnell Douglas, on such advanced, classified, eventually canceled projects as nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and nuclear power plants for space. He has provided written testimony to congressional hearings, appeared twice at the UN, and been a pioneer in many aspects of ufology, including Roswell, Majestic 12, the Betty Hill Marjorie Fish star map case, analysis of the Delphos, Kansas physical trace case, crashed saucers, flying saucer technology, and challenges to the SETI, silly effort to investigate, cultists. He is the author of the books Top Secret Magic and Crash at Corona, the definitive study on the Roswell incident. His website is www.stantonfriedman.com, STANTONFRIEDMAN.com. Enough of my yakking, let's boogie. This interview was recorded on December 7th, 2006. Stanton Friedman on the Binnall of America Audio, Season 2, Christmas Special. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Binnall of America Audio. Last year, we had a very special guest on for the holiday episode, and I wanted to do the same thing again this year. He is the author of Top Secret Magic and Crash at Corona, the definitive study of the Roswell incident. He needs no introduction. He is the father of modern-day ufology, and he's back here on Binnall of America Audio. Stanton Friedman, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be on again, as long as you're not calling me the grandfather.
No. I knew I wanted to get you back on the show, and I wanted to sort of discuss, let's call it sort of like the Stanton Friedman early years, if you will, or the pre-Roswell period. And what I really found interesting when I was doing a little research for this interview was that you started in 1958. That's when you first ordered that book that kind of started the whole snowball rolling downhill on the UFO investigation.
Yeah.
And, of course, in 1978, 20 years later, is when you heard about the Roswell incident. And it's really interesting that you had 20 years in the UFO field before you even discovered Roswell, but you're sort of typecast as the Roswell guy, so that must be kind of rough. So hopefully, in this interview, we can talk about that pre-Roswell period.
Okay, and I heard something about Roswell in the early 70s when I spoke with Lydia Sleppy, who had had a good sighting in Albuquerque. We got to her, a colleague and I, from her son, who was a forest ranger in California, who had a good sighting, said, after he told us about his report, that he really ought to talk to my mom. She had a great sighting in Albuquerque. So Bobby Ann Slate Geronda, who's no longer with us, and I talked to Lydia, and she told us about her sighting, but also mentioned that when she was at a radio station in Albuquerque, she worked there, they had a call from their affiliate in Roswell who said that a saucer had crashed and was being sent to Patterson right field, he actually said, I guess. And he wanted her to, she wasn't a journalist, she was an accountant actually, but she handled the typing and stuff. And the guy said, please put this out on the wire, newswire. So he started to dictate, and she's typing, and their bell rings, and there's a message comes up on the stuff she's typing that do not continue this transmission, FBI. Now, I know some people get very upset. What do you mean the FBI wasn't monitoring stuff? Well, if they were going to monitor anything anywhere, it would certainly be New Mexico. Two nuclear weapons labs, White Sands Missile Range, the formerly secret city Los Alamos. Kirtland was the largest employer in the state. Counterintelligence was a major concern there, and as it turns out, they were right, of course. The Soviets did have spies at Los Alamos. Two of them got executed, as a matter of fact, for treason. Anyway, so I talked to her, and she gave me a couple of names, the best she could remember at that time. We're going back to 47, and this is about 72, 73. And it came to a halt. I mean, I did find a couple of people, and a couple remembered something, a couple others remembered nothing, and where do I go from here? So that was the end of that. But that sort of primed me for when I talked to Jesse Marcel in 78. But you're certainly right that a lot of people think Roswell's what got me started and so forth, and not at all. And a little history before that, and it's important only because people have the wrong impression about who's interested in UFOs and who you're talking to and all this. I've seen some of the noisy negativist garbage about me, making it sound, really out in left field somewhere.
Yeah.
The point is that I read Edward Ruppelt's book, the report on unidentified flying objects back in 58, and it intrigued me. It didn't convince me. I shared it with a neighbor. He was even more, he was an engineer 10 years older than I was. I was only 24 at the time. That shows you how long ago it was. And Charlie was an engineer 10 years older, and he was more impressed than I was. And we each moved our own way. He worked in Connecticut. I moved to California. I had a good librarian in California. I read another 15 books or so, some of which were trash. And if I'd read them first, I'd have never read another book. And then what really sparked me was finding at the University of California, Berkeley Library, a copy of Project Blue Book, Special Report 14. This is a privately published copy. And it hadn't been mentioned in any of these 15 books that I had read. And holy cow, I was in data heaven. 240 charts, tables, graphs, maps. And what really got my attention was that the guy, Leon Davidson, who'd had this published, he's no longer with us either, had included the press release that went out in October 1955 about this study. And what was shocking, because I'd been looking at the data, was that there was this infamous lie from the Secretary of the Air Force. Now, I should stress that I've been working on classified programs, so I was accustomed to sometimes you got to be a little careful about what you say. You may skirt the truth. You try to avoid lying, etc. Mm-hmm. Here was a flat-out statement from the Secretary of the Air Force, Donald Quarles, who said, on the basis of this report, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. Now, that would seem to put the rest to anything exciting about flying saucers. The only trouble was, having looked at the data, the charts, the tables, it turns out that the unknowns were 21.5%, 7 times greater than we were told by the Secretary of the Air Force, and that they were completely separate from the ones that were listed as insufficient information. That was about 10%. So rather than putting the kibosh on the good sightings, he highlighted them, except nobody would know that if they didn't have the report, and they didn't distribute the report, and they didn't include any of the data. They put out a summary with it, and it doesn't include any of the data from those 240 charts, tables, graphs, and maps.
Yeah.
Now, this thing distressed me because, here's a flat-out lie from the Secretary of the Air Force, and I wasn't anti-Air Force. The aircraft nuclear propulsion program that I was working on when I first read Ruppelt's book was co-sponsored by the Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission. It was a big program. We were spending $100 million a year at General Electric in 1958 on aircraft nuclear propulsion systems. Oh, wow. I mean, 3,500 people full-time, 1,100 of them engineers and scientists. So I mention this only because I notice Wikipedia gives me credit for working only on paper studies. I was spending a lot of their money, boy, doing experiments at Oak Ridge and at Convair Fort Worth and so forth, and all kinds of other people. We actually operated jet engines on nuclear power, I might add.
Oh, wow.
It was hardware. Sure, the work was classified, but it wasn't a black program. The sign at the door said aircraft nuclear propulsion. And so finding that report really sparked my great interest, and I joined APRO and NICAP, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, to get their newsletters. They were sort of battling with each other, a little bit of feuding, kind of. Remember, NICAP at one time had 14,000 members, so it grew large. That was Major Donald Kehoe primarily. And so I joined those groups, and this really got me intrigued. I talked to colleagues at lunch when we brown bagged it. I was working on fusion propulsion systems for deep space travel. This was at Aerojet General Nucleonics in what was the walnut orchards of San Ramon, California. Now it's wall-to-wall housing ticky-tack. But I talked to colleagues and so forth, and I joined the groups, and I even wrote Amy Michel, a French researcher whose books were important to me, asking him for advice on how to get involved. And I obviously didn't take his advice because what he said was he recommended not getting involved. It's too much trouble.
Oh, wow.
Obviously, I didn't listen. And then I moved to Indianapolis to work for General Motors Corporation. It was Aerojet General Nucleonics in California. General Motors had a contract from the Atomic Energy Commission to look at military compact reactors. And this was an interesting idea. You have a problem with where do you get fuel for your tanks and your trucks and all that out on the battlefield. Why don't we put together a reactor that you can take apart, fly in, and you can produce ammonia from basically air, which has nitrogen in it, and water, and you can run military vehicles on ammonia, which you can do. Mm-hmm. The problem, of course, my work was in radiation shielding primarily, and shielding was an important part of the weight. So you do have to protect people when you're assembling and disassembling this nuclear reactor. So I was in charge of the shielding work, and I kept my interest in UFOs, again, talked to people. We worked in a closed area with a guard at the door because it was high security. And I didn't find out until I left the company that there were some people upset when I posted the NICAP bulletin board. But I got to know Frank Edwards. Mm-hmm. I was active in the Hemophilia Foundation chapter of Indianapolis. My son's a hemophiliac, and we were sponsoring a fundraising dinner. And because Frank was on the board of NICAP, he was a newsman. He had a big radio program and so forth. And so I convinced him to give a talk, for charitable benefits and so forth. So I got to know him a bit. And then he wrote his book, Flying Saucers Serious Business, which became a bestseller. And I had moved on to Pittsburgh to work for Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab on nuclear rocket engines, which we also built and successfully tested on the ground. And again, shielding was my bag. as you can imagine, anything that involves weight and nuclear heating and stuff like that would be significant.
Yeah.
Anyway, Frank sent me a copy of his book. I introduced him. We had him speak for our group in Pittsburgh. But I read the book, and I decided, it's time for me to do something. So I contacted Frank and said, hey, you got any names? Because he traveled a lot and because his book was so successful, he knew everybody in the media business. And he sent me some names, and one of them was a producer at a radio show called Contact, not the book, by Carl Sagan later on. And it was on KDKA Pittsburgh, which is the one of the biggest and oldest radio stations east of the Mississippi, 50,000-watt clear channel, et cetera. They had a big audience, especially at night. And it was one of those, don't call us, we'll call you. Okay. So a month or so later, I get a call from them. Gee, could you be on our program tonight at 7 o'clock? It was 6:30, you understand. Somebody had canceled, and I was probably number 8 on their list of people to call. But I didn't live far from the station. So I said, sure, why not? And I went on the program, and somebody at work, a woman technician, had a book review club, and Frank's book was their book that month. And they asked me if I would give a talk in her living room about flying saucers. That was my first lecture. And I did the talk show a number of times after that, did the chicken and peas circuit. Everybody wants free programs. And then, my talk title then was Flying Saucers Are Real. I'm still using that title. I don't make it UFOs are real because all flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in the flying saucers, not in the UFOs. Mm-hmm. But then something happened, I don't know what to call it, coincidence. One of 2 days that I rode to work, I lived in downtown Pittsburgh. Westinghouse was out in one of the suburbs called Large, a small town, with Joanne. She was a PhD, a supervisor at Westinghouse, and she lived in town as well. And my car was in a garage, so I needed a ride. And I'm telling her, gee, I'd like to speak at Carnegie Tech, which later became Carnegie Mellon University. And she says, well, why don't you talk to the dean? I said, well, I called Dr. So-and-so, and he wasn't interested. She said, Stan, the dean's my husband. He's heard you on the radio. Huh. Why don't you give him a call? Well, okay, why not? So I called, and he said, sure, I'd love to have you speak. And we wound up setting a date in the morning, 11 o'clock in the morning. And then he asked me, how much do you want? Well, I figure I got to take a half day off work here, and I'll ask for 100, and maybe I'll get as much as 50. Yeah. So I asked for the 100, sold, and then because I knew his wife, he told me what he was paying the other speakers in the series: $1,500, $1,700,
oh, wow.
$1,600.
Wow.
And you might say, hey, he got a bargain with you. Well, he did, but I got something out of the bargain too, because we had a very good crowd, a very good response, and he was kind enough to send a very enthusiastic letter to the agent through whom he had booked the other speakers. Mm-hmm. And they booked me at a crucial talk, Engineering Society of Detroit. I got $300 too, plus travel, so that was nice. But nice. The interesting thing was I found out that they were sold out a week in advance for 1,008 people for dinner and a talk. And there wasn't one negative question. Now, this is not a bunch of little old ladies in tennis shoes. Yeah. These are professional people. That was very, very encouraging. And then there was a second talk like that. You can see I'm leading up to something here. Okay, but yeah. In Pittsburgh, I convinced the chairman of a joint meeting of the local sections of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics and the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. Pittsburgh back then was a big research and development community, headquarters for Alcoa and Gulf Oil and Westinghouse and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. I convinced the guy at work who was chairman of this joint meeting, hey, you ought to have me speak. I've been speaking to technical groups. I'd already spoken to several sections of the IEEE electrical engineers. and the AIAA, American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. I'm a member of that group. I said, all it'll cost you'll be, dinner for me and my wife and a babysitter. Sold. So, okay, we go to dinner. It's a weekday night, and I'm ready to crawl through the floor. There were 25 people at the restaurant across from the hall where I was supposed to speak, and I felt, oh, jeez. I told them I've been getting good crowds and enthusiasm, and nobody. We go across the street, and the place is already half full. We wound up with a packed house, about 400 people. Again, no negative questions. I mean, I recognize my boss's boss's boss, 3 levels up. And now these are people I had to respect, So that was very encouraging to me. And so along the way here, as things are perking up in the speaking business and I'm working on nuclear rockets, I asked my boss, I said, I need a statement from the company. What are the rules here? I've got a mortgage, I got a house, I got a wife, I got a job, I got kids, I got a security clearance. I don't want to lose my job, so give me the rules. Mm-hmm. So my boss goes to his boss, I don't know who the word eventually came down from, and they gave me 3 rules. These are interesting rules. The first was you can say what you please on your time. The second was you can identify yourself as a Westinghouse nuclear physicist. And the third was we want you to start each lecture with a disclaimer. The views you're about to hear are mine and mine alone and not those of my employer. Now, who could ask for anything more than that?
Yeah.
You hear about the professors who don't mention my name and don't tell anybody about me because I'm afraid of losing my job and all this stuff. Now, the company did do something more than that. One day I get a call from my counterpart in radiation shielding at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. And Glenn says, Stan, how about giving your lecture to the local section of the American Nuclear Society? I said, fine, I'm a member of the American Nuclear Society. That would be great. He says, no, I mean on an expense account, Stan. I said, I don't make those decisions. Go up to the boss's boss, etc. And they said yes. So I went from Pittsburgh to Los Alamos, spent the day, gave a lecture, came back on an expense account. And everybody knew what was going on. This was not, we're going to talk about radiation shielding. And, by the way, I'll give a little lecture on the side.
Yeah.
And they had over 500 people, which for them was a huge crowd. So, and the same thing happened with an IEEE group, electrical engineers in Wilmington, Delaware. They wanted me to come on expense account, and the company said yes. Now, let's face it, Westinghouse is a corporate member of the American Nuclear Society and a corporate member of the Electrical Engineering Organization. So, it's not like they were fighting the current here, but still, they didn't have to be so helpful, and frankly, it was the very enthusiastic response of my professional colleagues all over the place. I spoke at engineering societies of Baltimore and Cincinnati. In Cincinnati, I was warned that there would be some debunkers, what I now call noisy negativists. And again, there had a packed house and no negative questions. And had friends. I used to live in Cincinnati when I worked for GE, and they were invited as guests. And they said, look, we can watch any time, but we watched the audience. When you started, they were leaning forward like they were ready to pounce. After a few minutes, they relaxed. And after a few more minutes, they were nodding their head in agreement. So it was these kinds of reactions that convinced me when the bottom fell out of the advanced nuclear and space systems business, as it certainly did, to go full-time lecturing. It wasn't crazy people. It wasn't religious nuts. It wasn't far-out people. And I've tried to continue the business of talking. I've talked to management clubs from McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed and so forth. And the reason for going through all this spiel is so that people will recognize it's okay. I've given more than 700 lectures. I've had 11 hecklers. 2 of them were drunk. Now, you're going to get that many if you're talking about sports, religion, politics, anything.
Yeah.
And if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen, as Harry Truman said,
Exactly.
So the early Stan Friedman was learning his trade, was getting a very good response, and it's continued ever since. And, part of it is that I make an effort to bring up the objections of the noisy negativists and demolish them. Yeah. I don't ignore them.
Yeah.
I don't talk past them. And I have open question and answer periods. In other words, no written questions where I can throw out the ones I don't want to answer. And, I get a good handle on my audiences, not only if they laugh at my jokes and stuff like that, but, I speak well-rehearsed extemporaneously. How's that?
There you go.
I don't read my papers. I do use slides, and I am most appreciative of the attention they pay. And nobody goes out screaming, "Oh my God, they're going to get us!" I'm not trying to scare anybody.
Okay, now, and let's hone in on one particular event here in your early years, and that is the 68 Congressional Committee on UFOs.
Well, yeah, the Congressional Committee on Science and Aeronautics. And I had met earlier, and he used to stop by in Pittsburgh when he was traveling through, Dr. James E. McDonald. Mm-hmm. We had a very active group in Pittsburgh, the UFO Research Institute of Pittsburgh, guys from Westinghouse and other places. We met at the board office in downtown Pittsburgh of the biggest accounting firm in town, as a matter of fact. Respectable,
Yeah.
And Jim McDonald stopped by several times. He allowed us to sell his paper, International UFOs, International Problems, something like that. And Jim had gotten hooked. He had been a sort of skeptic, as I had been certainly to begin with, but after a while he got convinced, and he started checking the Blue Book files and was astonished at all the good cases that had received no attention.
Yeah.
He used to fight with J. Allen Hynek about that. Why hadn't Hynek said anything, Anyway, Jim was going all over speaking to professional groups. He visited NICAP, found that they were doing good work, visited Project Blue Book, found out that they were doing lousy work. And he made use of some connections. He was a professor of physics at the Institute of Atmospheric Physics at the University of Arizona, in Arizona, and very well respected. And you'd think atmospheric physics would be important to UFOs, since most of the things that are sighted are in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about meteors or whatever, still you ought to know something about atmospheric physics. And Jim managed to, through contacts in Washington, get the interest of a congressman from Indiana to set up hearings. He was on this committee of science and astronautics. And there were 6 guys who gave testimony in person. And then through my congressman in Pittsburgh, I managed to get added to that list of people who could make a contribution in writing. There were 6 of us in writing and 6 of us in person. Mm-hmm. And I was the only one of the 12 without a PhD, incidentally. I'm proud of that, so to speak. And it was quite a variety of backgrounds. There were some debunkers. Dr. Donald Howard Menzel, a Harvard University professor of astronomy, had written over the years a total of 3 anti-UFO books, and was a power who influenced a lot of people. I mean, Harvard and astronomy, Turns out later that apparently he was a member of the Operation Majestic 12, and he also did all kinds of classified work for the government. None of this was known at the time.
Yeah.
Carl Sagan was a contributor, my University of Chicago classmate for 3 years. J. Allen Hynek, who was the scientific consultant of Project Blue Book, was a contributor. Dr. Robert M. L. Baker III analyzed a number of pictures. There was a sociologist from Stanford, Dr. James Harder, from University of California, Berkeley. It was just a great group of people, even if you didn't agree with everybody.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, nothing much came out of the hearings, except it provided a 240-some page volume of papers by real scientists, most of whom, certainly the positivists more than the negativists, had seriously looked at the evidence. And this had not really been done before. There were congressional hearings 2 years earlier, but they were very limited in scope. Secretary of the Air Force, a guy named Brown, sat down and said, no, there's really nothing to it and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But these hearings, and as a matter of fact, I am so impressed with the work of Jim McDonald. He committed suicide a couple of years later. It's a long story, and it's told in the excellent book about Jim Firestorm by Ann Druffel. Anyway, Jim's paper, when you print it in readable print, in the original volume, it's hard to read. It's very small print. It's available on my website at www.stantonfriedman.com. It's 71 pages long. He's got data on 41 separate cases, subdivided into 6 groups, each group dealing with one of the objections from the noisy negativists. You know, how come they're never seen over big cities? He gives you a bunch of big city cases. Why aren't they seen on radar? And he gives you half a dozen good radar cases. And how come the professionals who watch the sky, meteorologists, astronomers, pilots, don't see UFOs? He gives you a bunch of sightings by those. So how come there's always only one witness, where that witness is a kook, where you define kook as somebody who claims to have observed a UFO? Of course, he gives you a bunch of multiple witness sightings. So that paper, I tell people, if you want one paper that gives you a whole host of good sightings that he personally investigated. You talk to all the crew members on the RB-47 reconnaissance plane sighting over the Gulf of Mexico and then Texas and Oklahoma, for example. That paper will answer your objections, because there are no good objections once you've read that paper.
Yeah.
So, you know, that was a turning point for me. I still, at every lecture, my standard college lecture, in other words, Flying Saucers Are Real, illustrated with slides. At the beginning, I talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies, and this is certainly one of them.
Yeah.
For, obvious reasons. It's got lots of data from professional people who spent lots of time. I get so sick of the research by proclamation from the nasty, noisy negativists. Carl Sagan said there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable, which is certainly true, and there are reliable sightings that aren't interesting, which is certainly true. But then he says there are no interesting and reliable sightings, which is totally false. And Project Blue Book Special Report 14 showed that. The more reliable the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable. That's significant information. And why he says what he says, I don't know. Alan Hynek once asked him about several cases, and in each case he said, well, he hadn't looked at that, He just doesn't have time to dig into them. Well, darn it, if you haven't looked at the evidence, preface your remarks with, I don't know anything about this subject, but my personal opinion. You're all entitled to personal opinions, but professional opinions should require knowledge and ethics.
Yeah.
And when I check my audiences on these 5 large-scale scientific studies, Blue Book Special Report 14, these congressional hearings, Alan Hynek's book, The UFO Experience, the University of Colorado study, the Condon Report so-called, and the UFO evidence, I ask after each one, I show a slide, tell them what's in it. How many of you have read this? I'm lucky if I get 1 or 2% who've read any of them.
Yeah.
That helps keep down the number of hecklers, you see. Because, well, I can come back to somebody, well, you haven't read any of this stuff, have you? I've done this twice. Well, no. I said, well, what's the difference between us, isn't it? I give you my conclusions that some UFOs are alien spacecraft, that we're dealing with a cosmic Watergate, that there aren't any good arguments against those conclusions. And you haven't looked at any of that evidence, so whose opinion is worth more? It's amazing how quick they shut up after that.